Okay, perfect. Of course. All right. It seems we are almost live. Here we go. Okay, we're live. And like I said, we're going to give people a few minutes to kind of trickle in before we actually start the presentation. And I will let you know as soon as we are ready to start.
Okay,
And of course, I will give that introduction.
sounds good.
All right. I just got a notice on my phone that we're live. Always a good sign. Welcome to the kickoff of Reunited in Pride, Southeast Kansas Pride 2022. SEK Pride is sponsored by Project Q&A. Project Q&A is the leading nonprofit of Reunited in Pride, Southeast Kansas Pride 2022. SEK Pride is sponsored by Project Q&A. Project Q&A is the leading nonprofit of Reunited in Pride. Project Q&A is the leading nonprofit organization working to educate, empower, and raise visibility for the over 2.9 million LGBTQIA plus individuals who call rural America home. Thank you for tuning in on your lunch for our first Lunch and Learn workshop. Today we have author Andrew Maraniss with us discussing the first openly gay baseball player. Please welcome Andrew Maraniss.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. This is a real honor for me to be part of Pride Festival there in Southeast Kansas. I'm talking to you from my office in Nashville, Tennessee, where I work at the athletics department at Vanderbilt University, which is my alma mater. And I've lived here in Nashville for over 30 years. But I do have some roots in Kansas. My great-grandfather, Andrew, was from another part of the state. He was from Cocker City, Kansas, which I understand is the home of the world's largest ball of twine. So I don't know if anybody has ever been out there. I've actually never been to Cocker City. I've spent a lot of time in Lawrence, Kansas for one of my previous books. And I'll be coming back to DeSoto, Kansas in October to speak at a middle school there. But anyway, this is really something that I've been looking forward to, a chance to talk about Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player and played for the Dodgers and the A's in the late 70s. My book, Singled Out, is intended for both teenagers and adults. It's considered a young adult book, but written in a way that is equally appealing to adults. And it's been interesting to have a book out this past year. This book came out last March. Interesting times to have a book out about a gay character, as I'm sure is the case in Kansas, is definitely the case here in Tennessee. There's been such a crackdown from certain elements of the community here on books dealing with gay characters or gay themes. Books being banned from schools or taken off lists in libraries, or librarians and teachers, just kind of the chilling effect on them and being reluctant to either have a book like this in their library or certainly to invite me in to speak about it. That's been a big part of my career as an author, is visiting high schools and middle schools, talking about my books. And I've yet to have a single school invite me in to come talk about Glenn Burke. So that tells you something about state of the world that we're in right now. I wanted to walk through PowerPoint that I have here and give you a little bit of a sense of who I am and how I came to this story. And then I hope that folks have questions. I'd love to answer questions at the end. But this is me when I had a little bit of hair. When I was in middle school. I was born in Wisconsin, so I'm a big Brewers, Packers, and Bucks fan. But we moved to Washington, D.C. when I was in first grade. And so I was a kid that played baseball and loved to read and write about sports as well. When I was 13, I started this little magazine that you see here called AJ's Sports Journal. And it wasn't for class or for an assignment or a grade or anything. It was just something I did for fun, and wrote about my favorite teams, which at the time, as they are now, were the Packers and the Brewers. And I did my first interview ever with John Feinstein. And some of you may be familiar with John. He's probably one of the best-selling sports authors of all time. His famous book was A Season on the Brink, about Indiana basketball and Bobby Knight, but he's written dozens of other books. At the time, he was a reporter at the Washington Post, wasn't even covering sports. He was covering local news. And my dad has had a career at the Washington Post for over 40 years. And so they've been friends all that time. And John came over to our house and I interviewed him and listed that Q&A in my sports magazine. 2 years later, we moved to Washington, D.C., from Washington, D.C. to Austin, Texas. And so I went to high school in Austin and was the sports editor of our high school paper. And one day there was a poster on the wall advertising a scholarship to Vanderbilt University for high school sports writers. And so I applied for that scholarship and was lucky enough to win it. And that's what brought me to Nashville. I've been associated with Vanderbilt ever since, with the exception of 1 year where I was the media relations manager for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, as they were known at the time, in 1998, which was their first season as an expansion team in the major leagues. While I was in school, I had a chance to learn about the man you see in this book, Strong Inside. His name was Perry Wallace. And I know Kansas has had a basketball player named Perry Ellis. This is Perry Wallace. He was the first Black basketball player in Southeastern Conference history, played at Vandy in the late 60s. And so the SEC, I'm sure you know, is the conference that has the deep South schools like Mississippi, Mississippi State, Auburn, Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee. And so Perry was the first Black basketball player in that conference. I was taking a Black history class as a sophomore at Vanderbilt and wrote a paper about his experience. I interviewed him. He was by then a professor at the University of Baltimore. And I interviewed him for a paper, and 17 years later, came back to it to write this book. I had never written a book before, but I felt that Perry's story was incredibly overlooked, but important in the history of sports, but also the window into race and racism and segregation that his story told. And so I wrote this biography of Perry, became, to my surprise and my publisher's surprise, a New York Times bestseller on the sports list and the civil rights list. And I adapted that book also for middle school students. And so when I mentioned that I travel around to schools, it was because I turned Strong Inside into a book for younger people and visited 25 states, telling this story about racism through the lens of sports. And so that's become kind of my niche in writing, is writing what are considered young adult books that deal with sports and social issues. And so my second book is called Games of Deception. It's a story of the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And so that book deals with fascism and anti-Semitism in basketball. And there's a Kansas connection there. Half of the men's Olympic basketball team in 1936 came from McPherson, Kansas, where the guys worked for an oil refinery. And they had an outstanding basketball team that qualified to represent half of the U.S. Olympic team that year. So I spent a lot of time in McPherson and Lawrence researching that book. And then my new book that comes out next week actually is called Inaugural Ballers. And it's the story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team that came along 40 years after the men's team at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. And so this story is told in the context of the women's rights movement of the 1970s, and it's times to be published this year, 2022, which is the 50th anniversary of Title IX. You know, and there's been so much attention paid to these last 50 years of growth of women's sports, progress made, but also a lot of progress yet to be made. And so the book that came out most recently in between Games of Deception and Inaugural Ballers is Singled Out, this story of Glenn Burke. And so as I was finishing writing Games of Deception, I was looking for a new story to tell. I was talking with my agent, Alex Shane, and he knew that baseball is my favorite sport. I had told him about my experience visiting middle schools and high schools and just how impressed I was with the kids and how invested they were in these social issues that I was writing about, and including in various ways, LGBTQIA plus themes had come up in some of the conversations that I had with these kids. And I felt like in talking to Alec that the time was right for a story for teens about Glenn Burke, who was this overlooked but really important figure in the history of Major League Baseball and also in gay rights. And a lot of people at the time that I got started writing this book had never heard of Glenn Burke, even if they were big baseball fans, even if they were invested in gay rights movement, they didn't know the story of Glenn Burke. And so it was really important to me to tell this story in a way that was felt real and authentic and well-researched and true to two important audiences, the baseball people out there. Whenever I write a book, I want the people who are real experts in that sport to feel like I'm not a visitor dropping in on their sport, that I know it backwards and forwards. And so this is a baseball book in some ways, but in its most important ways, it's not a baseball book at all. It's about gay black man in America in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, but 70s primarily, and how his story fit into the context of the gay rights movement at that time. And so I was really excited when Ken Schultz, and some of you may have heard of Ken, he writes for outsports.com, probably the leading LGBT sports website out there. And he wrote a review of the book, and he said, well, many books straddle the line between sports and history. Singled out as the first baseball biography I've read that definitely tells the story of a player's life set against the narrative of the struggle for LGBTQ rights. It's also the first time I'd seen my favorite sport examined in a full-length biography along touchstones like Stonewall, the Anita Bryant backlash, and Harvey Milk. As a gay baseball fan, seeing the intersection of those historic through lines was exhilarating. And so that was really important to me, that a gay writer, a gay sports writer, felt like the book hit the right notes from the LGBT's perspective as well. I'm straight living here, but feel like it's incumbent upon all of us to understand everyone's story. And if baseball is the national pastime, then this should be a sport for everyone. And Glenn Burke's story shows that we still have a long way to go in fulfilling those promises, what this country is supposed to be about and what this sport is supposed to be about. So the book also got this recognition from Esquire magazine alongside adult books. So again, I feel like this book is not just for teens, but for adults as well. Some detractors of Glenn will look at his statistics in the major leagues, where he only lasted about 2.5 years, and we'll talk about that, and say that the only reason he gets any attention is because he was gay, and that he really was not a good player, which is not true. And so I often show this slide here with his statistics. If you look at his minor league stats, he was hitting over 300 almost every year. Look at his stolen base numbers. He was setting stolen base records in, I think, 3 different leagues that he played in. He set the all-time stolen base record. He had power. He hit 11 home runs one year, 10 the next, 12 another year, right? So he was a complete player that had speed and power, a great arm. Dusty Baker, a longtime major leaguer who I interviewed for the book, said that Glenn had the best jump on a ball in the outfield that he'd ever seen. He had a great arm. And so he was a really good baseball player. You have to be to make the major leagues. But in the minors, he was among the best players in the Dodgers system. In fact, Joe Gilliam, one of the coaches for the Dodgers, said that they felt that Glenn had the talent and the potential to become the next Willie Mays. So there you're talking about a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest players in Major League history. And that's the type of talent that they felt that Glenn Burke had. Rupert Jones, who played Major League Baseball for a decade, I believe, and was also a great basketball player, said that Glenn was the best athlete he ever saw. He told me that in an interview. In high school, Glenn was a guard and a forward at Berkeley High School in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, California, and led his team as a senior to an undefeated season and the Northern California equivalent of the state championship. He felt like his entire life that he was probably a better basketball player than even a baseball player. He could touch the top of the backboard. He could leap that high to touch the top of the backboard. He had just enormous biceps and really chiseled athlete. And everybody that I interviewed who saw him said he was the best athlete that they had ever seen. Of course, this is at a time when stereotypes in this country would have told straight people, they would have believed that you couldn't be gay and be the best athlete that anyone ever saw. It was thought that there were quotes of executives in Major League Baseball saying there couldn't possibly be a gay man in the majors because you had to be a good athlete to do it. And if you were gay, you couldn't be a good athlete. That was sort of the stereotypes and the assumptions that certain people had that Glenn was fighting against, closeted at that time as a young baseball player. Now, in 1974, Glenn would have been a prospect in the Dodgers organization, a minor leaguer. At that time, the Advocate, the well-known magazine, sent a letter to every Major League Baseball team asking to speak to management there about the prospect of there being gay players in their organization, closeted gay players, or what was the prospect for gay men to play in the major leagues. And Tom Mee, who was the PR director for the Minnesota Twins, was one of the baseball executives that responded publicly to the advocate's letter. And this wasn't like a private message that he sent or a derogatory comment that he made to a coworker. This is what he wrote back to the magazine. He said, "The cop-out, immoral lifestyle of the tragic misfits espoused by your publication has no place in organized athletics at any level. Your colossal gall in attempting to extend your perversion to an area of total manhood is just simply unthinkable." And so, Glenn would have seen this. He would have read this. This would have been talked about in baseball circles. And this is the type of pressure that he had on himself as he's coming up as a minor leaguer, trying to make the major leagues, trying to become the very best version of himself that he can as an athlete, and knowing that if his secret was exposed, that this is the type of attitude that people around him had privately and would publicly say to his face. And so how can you deal with that as a young athlete? It's hard enough to make the major leagues anyway, let alone knowing the level of support around you. And of course, this wasn't true just in baseball, but in all walks of life in America. And I thought this was just a really stark example of that latent homophobia that surrounded people like Glenn in the 1970s. Now, at the same time, and Ken's review mentions Anita Bryant. And of course, she was the Miss America runner-up who was a spokesperson for orange juice and all sorts of Tupperware and what might be considered, quote unquote, like wholesome aspects of American life. At the same time that Glenn would have been competing for the Dodgers in spring training in Vero Beach, Florida, in the early and mid 1970s. Anita Bryant was a spokesperson for Florida orange juice and also a spokesperson for an anti-gay legislation in Miami, Florida. And so this is happening in the same state at the same time that Glenn is trying to come along as a Major League Baseball player. And she was opposed to an ordinance in Dade County, Florida, that protected the rights of gay and lesbian workers. They couldn't be fired for their job simply because of their sexuality. And she was opposed to that. And she said, "I would give my life if necessary to protect my children. I'm concerned with giving them the right food and clothes to wear. And if I let up on the spiritual and physical thing, what good is it? If they're exposed to homosexuality, I might as well feed them garbage. Homosexuality is an abomination to the Lord." And so these are types of views that mainstream Americans were expressing at the time. And again, shows the environment that Glenn was operating in. And so at this time, he was largely closeted. There were some of his teammates that were either he let them in on the secret or they're starting to figure things out. And he's wondering, what's going to happen if the manager of my minor league team finds out that I'm gay? What's going to happen if the general manager and the owner of the Los Angeles Dodgers learn this secret? How am I going to deal with this? And he had sort of conflicting ideas about it. On the one hand, in 1974, he said, "I'm just going to have to hit 300 and lead the league in steals. Then nobody can say shit to me." That was kind of his attitude. If I'm good enough, they're just going to have to accept me for who I am. And so at times he existed with that attitude. But there are other times where he felt a little bit more ambivalent about things. And he said, and I wrote this in the book, part of him wanted to hit 300 and become a superstar so that if the secret ever got out, he could tell the haters to go to hell. But another part of him, unlike anyone else on the roster, yearned for mediocrity. If he hit 250, he could remain relatively anonymous and guard his privacy. And so, part of him's thinking, I just need to blend in, not make any waves, not be too good, not be too bad, just be an average player. No one will pay any special attention to me, and that's how I'll float by. And so you just imagine any other minor leaguer sort of hoping for mediocrity. That's not the way you make it to the major leagues. And so when you look at Glenn's statistics and understand all of these thoughts were on his mind, and that he realized he didn't have the support of the people behind him. He wasn't even sure if he himself should be as good as he could possibly be. We don't know how good Glenn could have possibly been because of these pressures on him. Now, in 1976, Glenn is called up to the Dodgers for the first time. He plays briefly with the team that year. In 1977, he's still considered a rookie because of the limited number of games he played in 76. And he was the most popular player on the team. And so oftentimes now you'll hear sports commentators or managers or coaches talk about the prospect of a gay player on a certain baseball team or football team or basketball team, and they'll talk about the supposed distraction that that would create. Glenn was anything but a distraction on the Dodgers. By this time, his teammates all were onto his secret. He hadn't publicly come out yet, but his teammates knew that he was gay because he would, they told some of them, but other players would notice that he would not go out to the same nightclubs with them, or he was always making excuses to get out of dates that he was set up on by his teammates, or they saw men coming to pick him up at the team hotel, right? So they were on to the secret, but his teammates loved Glenn. And Dusty Baker, who you see here pictured number 12, said that Glenn was the most popular player on the team. He was funny. Glenn was known for imitating the best Black comedians of that day, like Richard Pryor, and he'd walk around the clubhouse telling jokes. He loved music, and Glenn was the one that would bring this giant boombox into the locker room and play music before games. Glenn was a great dancer. The guys would go out to discos. This was a disco era. And Glenn was the most popular guy on the dance floor until he would sneak away and go to a gay bar in whatever town they were in. And so in the 1977 season, and you see Glenn giving a high five here to Dusty Baker. And this is the other thing that Glenn is known for. He's credited as the inventor of the high five. And this is a story of how that happened. So in 1977, the Dodgers had 3 players, including Dusty Baker here, and also Reggie Smith and Steve Garvey, who had already hit 30 home runs. If Dusty were to hit one more home run, he would have 30, and that would give them 4 players, all with 30 or more homers, the first major league team in history to do that. And so it's the last month of the season. Dusty Baker is stuck on 29 for what seems like eternity. It's a couple weeks, and it comes down to the last series of the season in Los Angeles against the Houston Astros. And in the first 3 games of that series, Dusty does not hit a homer. And so now it's down to the last game of the season. And J.R. Richard is pitching for the Astros. And if there's any baseball fans on here who remember the 70s era of baseball, J.R. Richard was like a flamethrower. He threw 100 miles an hour, incredibly hard pitcher to hit. Dusty's resigned to the fact that he's probably not going to hit this home run. He's going to let his teammates down. They're not going to set their record. Doesn't hit a homer in his first 2 at-bats. Finally, his 3rd time up, he does hit a home run. And Glenn Burke happens to be on deck. He's going to hit next. And as Dusty crosses home plate, the crowd is going crazy, cheering. And Glenn Burke raises his arm, and Dusty Baker slaps it. And the Dodgers coined the term high five. And so Glenn and Dusty were the first 2 people to high five. When I interviewed Dusty, I said, well, who gets credit for really inventing it? He said, you've got to give the credit to Glenn. Pretty much anything cool in this life comes out of the Bay Area of California, and that's where Glenn Burke was from. And so give him the credit. And this was totally in character or in step with the type of person Glenn Burke was. He was a great teammate, right? And so he was celebrating not his own success, but his teammates' success. You know, he was a fun-loving guy. This was a fun thing to do. And so the fact that Glenn Burke invented the high five is perfectly fitting with the type of person that Glenn was. Later that season, he starts this picture of him in with the bat. He's preparing for a World Series game. So Glenn was considered a good enough player that he started 2 games for the Dodgers against the Phillies in the playoffs. And then he started game 1 of the World Series in 1977 at Yankee Stadium against the mighty New York Yankees. And so the idea that Glenn wasn't a good enough player and he only gets publicity because of this fact that he was gay is simply not true. He was a great player who, even as a rookie, was playing in the World Series. However, he was dealing with incredible homophobia within his own organization. So you see Tommy Lasorda here, the famous manager of the Dodgers at that time. Picture beneath Lasorda with the man holding the light up to his face, that's Tommy Lasorda Jr., known as Spunky Lasorda, and he was gay. Manager of the Dodgers' son was gay. And Tommy Jr. was often around the team. He would come to Florida to spring training. Sometimes he would be on road trips with his dad, going from city to city. Players on the Dodgers knew that Lasorda Jr., Spunky, was gay, although Tommy Sr. would never publicly admit that. And when Lasorda Jr. died of AIDS later, Lasorda Sr. refused to not acknowledge the cause of his own son's death. But Glenn Burke and Tommy Lasorda Jr. became friends. You know, 2 gay men around this Dodgers team. became friends. Not too surprising, but it was not something that Lasorda Sr. was happy about. He resented this friendship between his son and his player. And when he realized that he had a gay player on his team, he wanted to get rid of Glenn Burke. And so this other picture you see here, that's not Glenn in the Dodgers cap, but the man in the suit is Dodgers general manager Al Campanis. And after the 1977 season, when Glenn has played in the World Series, Campanis schedules a meeting with Glenn Burke during the offseason. Glenn thinks this meeting is to talk about what his role will be on the team the following year. But Campanis has other ideas in mind. He wants to cover up the fact that Glenn is gay. And he comes into this meeting and says, Glenn, we would like you to get married. We feel like our players perform better when they're married. They're not worried about, being out at the bars late at night on the road. They have a more stable life. And Glenn says, to a woman? And when Campanis says yes, Glenn says he's not going to do that. He's not going to go along with that charade. Then Campanis says, well, we really like this to happen. We'll pay you $75,000 for a nice honeymoon. And Glenn knows that this is essentially a bribe to cover up who he is, and he refuses to go along with it. And so in his own way, I think this is when Glenn really stood up, not only for himself, but for gay men and women everywhere, and played his role in the gay rights movement by refusing to go along with covering up who he was. And so at that point, Glenn understands that his days with the Dodgers probably over. And he's correct. By spring training of the following season, the 78 season, there start to appear articles in the Los Angeles papers about how the Dodgers are losing faith in Glenn Burke. And the reporters don't know why. Lasorda and Campanis are not telling them the real reason. They're saying, oh, Glenn's just not a good enough hitter. We don't really have a place for him on this team. But it's clear that he's losing his job because of his sexuality. And so early in that 1978 season, Glenn is traded to the Oakland A's, which in some ways he believes is probably a good thing. He grew up in the Oakland area in Berkeley, and so he thinks maybe this is where he'll get a new shot. The manager of the A's is Billy Martin, who also went to Berkeley High, so his same high school, and he feels some familiarity with him. When Glenn is traded, this is an incredibly unpopular move with the Dodger player. So I said, we're really supportive of Glenn. There were articles at the time of the trade saying that the reporters saw Dodger players sitting at their lockers crying over the fact that Glenn had been traded. Major league players crying. Don Sutton, Steve Garvey, sitting in their locker room crying that this rookie fourth outfielder had been traded. That tells you the type of charisma and respect that Glenn had amongst his teammates. That's not necessarily the case with the A's. These weren't guys that had known Glenn forever. They hadn't come up through the minor leagues with him. They didn't know really much about Glenn, except they had heard the rumors that he was gay, and he was not welcomed with the same sort of respect that he had with the Dodgers. In fact, the manager of the A's, Billy Martin, said that he wasn't going to let a gay player, quote unquote, contaminate his team. That's what he told the sports writers. He introduced Glenn to his new teammates in Oakland with the F slur to those teammates. And early in spring training, he sent Glenn down to the minor league camp. And Glenn knew that he was never going to get another shot to play in the major leagues with the A's. Now, another piece of sort of fun trivia that goes along with Glenn's stint with the Oakland A's. So he invented the high five. And then when he got to the A's, there was a young bat boy for the A's named Stanley Burrell, better known later in his life as MC Hammer. And so there you see MC Hammer as a young man when he was a bat boy with the Oakland A's at the same time that Glenn was playing for the team. Now, I mentioned that Glenn is sent down to the minor leagues, and he knows he's never going to get called back up to the majors as long as Billy Martin is manager. And so he decides to quit the game. He retires. But I do think it's unfair in a way to say that Glenn quit. He wasn't really a quitter. I would say it's more accurate to say he was run out of the game over his sexuality. He had two organizations, the Dodgers and the A's, that refused to have a gay player on their team. So is that Glenn quitting, or is that MLB, through its own homophobia, running him out? So Glenn moves back to San Francisco. He lives in the Castro district. This is 1970. 79, sort of the heyday of the Castro. He starts to play softball for various bars in the area. And imagine having a Major League Baseball player show up on your softball team, wins multiple championships, the Gay World Series. This is the time of the Gay Games coming to San Francisco, sort of a version of the Olympics. And Glenn wins multiple medals in different sports in Gay Games 1 and Gay Games 2. And so he's sort of a celebrity in the Castro, this former major leaguer who's not hiding who he is, that is showing up at the same places as everyone else. And Glenn said that this period of his life, in a way, was sort of a heaven on earth. It was the happiest that he ever was in some regards. But pretty quickly, this heaven on earth becomes a hell on earth as his teammates become sick with a mysterious illness and begin to die of AIDS. And so the AIDS epidemic comes along while Glenn's living this post-baseball life in the Castro. In 1982, Glenn decides try to make a comeback in a way. This is when he comes out publicly to the baseball world, to the sports world, to the world beyond the Castro. Through an interview, we see a picture of him here on the Today Show, an interview with Bryant Gumbel, who was in his first year as the host of the Today Show. Glenn flies to New York from California, gives an interview. There's a lot of attention about the gay Dodger. He's even on the cover of a magazine that was similar to Sports Illustrated called Inside Sports Magazine, a story about Glenn. And he's hopeful that as people read this article, people in baseball, they'll realize that he wasn't not playing anymore because he wasn't good enough, or the Dodgers didn't think he was a good enough player, that he was run out of the game over his sexuality, and that some team will then take a chance on him and say, well, we'd be willing to have a gay player on our team. He was a good ball player. Let's sign him. Yeah, that's Glenn's hope. But that never comes. There's very little sort of legs to the story. Glenn gives the interview. There's the story in the magazine, but there's really no further coverage, and he gets no interest from any other major league teams. And so that's a really disappointing moment for Glenn. Pretty quickly after that, he's also hit by a car crossing the street in San Francisco. He has pretty much spent all of the money that he made as a major league player. He becomes addicted to drugs, partly to numb the pain of the accident, the traffic accident, and partly to numb the emotional pain of being robbed of his livelihood and robbed of his gifts as a baseball player. He ends up living large stretches of time homeless on the streets of San Francisco. He contracts AIDS and he dies in 1995. He was largely forgotten until the last weeks of his life, when someone who knows Glenn out on the streets calls the A's and says, hey, you've got a player who's dying, who's living on the streets. You need to do something to support him. And so the Oakland A's do lend a measure of support. They set up a running tab for Glenn at a restaurant where he can at least eat. They help find some clinics where he can receive a little bit of medical support, healthcare support. And then Glenn's sister, Lutha, takes him in and nurses him over the last weeks of Glenn's life. Newspapers around the country write these articles about this forgotten player, the gay Dodger who's dying of AIDS. And so there's some coverage of Glenn in the last weeks of his life, but he's largely forgotten and abandoned by Major League Baseball. He's been inducted into a Rainbow Walk of Fame in San Francisco. If you've ever been to the Castro and seen these markers in the sidewalk there, Glenn is remembered in that regard. And then just in the last couple of years, finally, the Oakland A's and the LA Dodgers have begun to acknowledge Glenn's existence and his significance of his Major League Baseball career. Ignored him for since 1995 until basically 2021, when Major League Baseball, like a lot of professional sports leagues, is celebrating Pride Month. We'll have a Pride Night. And you can argue, I think, either way, whether these are like legitimate acts of good faith and support for LGBTQ community, or if they're just opportunities to sell tickets and sell rainbow hats. You know, certainly at the time Glenn was playing, he would have welcomed any team acknowledging the existence of a gay player or welcoming gay fans to the park. That was not done when he was a player. And so there is some element of this being a positive development, but I think there's also an element of this being just for show, and trying to sell tickets and merchandise. The A's have started to rename their Pride Night Glenn Burke Pride Night. And so I think that's a step in the right direction also. But a couple of years ago, I wrote an article for the LA Times asking, well, why haven't the Dodgers done anything to honor Glenn? And not only just to honor him, but to acknowledge his existence. I found this tweet from 2012 where the Dodgers mentioned that Dusty Baker and Glenn Burke had done the first high five in history. But that was the only mention of Glenn on Dodgers Twitter until last year ever. They had no mention of his name on their website, no stories about the history that he made. And this is the team that drafted him, that he came up in the minor leagues with, that he played in the World Series with, right? If the Dodgers celebrate the history of Jackie Robinson and having the first Black player in Major League history on their team, but they never celebrated having the first openly gay player on that team. And so I kind of called the Dodgers out on that in this article. And so I was happy this year, the Dodgers responded to that. And they honored Glenn at their Pride Night earlier this season. They had Glenn's brother, Sidney, throughout the first pitch at the game. They had these jerseys at the game. And the marketing director for the Dodgers, who is gay himself, said this was an important part of their history, even if there was, even if the Dodgers had, really embarrassed themselves in the way they treated Glenn when they ran him off the team back in the 70s. And so my book about Perry Wallace, that basketball player, he experienced a similar thing when he was at Vanderbilt in the 1970s and telling the truth about the racism that he encountered. A lot of white fans didn't want to hear it, and they shot the messenger. They were called Perry angry or ungrateful and that sort of thing. And it wasn't until 30 or 40 years later that Perry's still telling the same truth, that the people in Nashville or at Vanderbilt had changed enough that they were willing to hear it and to acknowledge the mistakes of the past and try to learn from that and make things better. And I asked Perry about that, and he said, well, reconciliation without the truth is just acting. And a lot of times organizations, schools, families, want to project to the world that everything's better now, let's have a happy photo op. But if they haven't really dealt with the truth of how they got in that situation in the first place, it's just for show, it's just acting. But if the truth is present, then there's an opportunity for real reconciliation and healing and learning and progress. And so I'm not quite sure if you can honestly say the truth is present in Major League Baseball or with the Dodgers or with the A's. They've named their nights after Glenn, but are they really telling the full story? And so that I hope that my book will help bring the truth to this situation.